Hello, and welcome to today's virtual seminar, From Doomsday to Hope, covering solutions to the climate and energy crisis. I'm Amanda Sardonis with the Environment and Natural Resources Program at the Belfer Center. I want to thank our fellow Harvard Kennedy School co-sponsors for this event, the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy, the Arctic Initiative at the Belfer Center, and the Climate, Energy, and Environment Professional Interest Council that's run by our incredible students. We are recording this seminar and we will post it to the ENRP website so you can view it at your leisure or send it to friends that you know were not able to join us live today. We will take audience questions through the Q&A function in Zoom today, so you can click the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen and type in your questions at any time during the event. And today's seminar is the latest in a long-standing series on science and the media that's organized by our Senior Fellow and distinguished science journalist, Cristine Russell, who is also our moderator today. And this series is designed in part to help us understand how the media coverage covers complicated and often controversial scientific issues like climate change, and how that information is delivered and consumed by the public, and how we all can improve science communication. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Chris Russell. She is an award-winning journalist who has written about science, health, the environment, and climate for 4 decades. Chris has written for Scientific American, The Atlantic, Columbia Journalism Review, and other publications, and is a former national reporter for the Washington Post. She's a past president of the Council for the Advancement of Science Writing and the National Association of Science Writers. In 2017, she co-chaired the World Conference of Science Journalists. And in 2020, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. And now over to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Amanda. And I'm excited that we are doing something positive today. We're looking at solutions to the climate and energy crisis. We have 2 of the top environmental reporters in the country with us, Sarah Kaplan of the Washington Post and Sammy Roth of the Los Angeles Times. Sarah is a climate reporter at the Washington Post, as she puts it, covering humanity's response to a warming world. And she's been at the Post for 8 years and previously reported on earth science and the universe. She's the winner of the 2019 Walter Sullivan Award for Excellence in Science Journalism Features. A Brooklyn native, she credits, and I like the way she puts it, a lifelong love of the New York Mets with preparing her somewhat for the frustration, disappointment, and occasional bursts of hope that come with covering climate change. Sammy Roth covers energy for the LA Times, and he writes their weekly Boiling Point newsletter. He's been at the Times for 3 years and previously reported for the Desert Sun and USA Today, and focused on renewable energy, climate change, electric vehicles, and utilities and public lands. And he has a baseball connection too. I guess this is Environmental Reporters Unite. He grew up in Westwood, California, and would very much like to see the Dodgers win the World Series again. So we're not going to be talking about baseball, but we are talking about climate change, which has become such a huge story that it is an institution-wide story for most news, for most newspapers. And we all know that a lot of the news is bad news. Things have been getting worse. But in the midst of this, there's been a new push towards solutions journalism, at looking at the big problems and asking questions about how we can do better in approaching these issues that seem so intractable. And Sammy, you had a recent column which you talked about journalists having hope over despair and engaging in what you called fearless climate coverage. Can you talk a little bit about how you personally approach the climate beat and energy beat?
Definitely. Thank you for the introduction, Chris. And I'm, excited to be there and be here and hopefully try to share some things that are useful. One of the things that I really like about covering the energy beat specifically within sort of the climate realm is it is an area where positive things are happening and where there's, I think, legitimate reason and room for hope and optimism about the future. Especially being in California, it's not like we've got it all figured out here, that everything is perfect, but there's movement in the right direction. I mean, when you look at the power mix in California, was something like 60% non-carbon last year. When you look at the electric grid, and that's going up all the time, where solar is getting built, wind is getting built, batteries are becoming cheaper all the time and starting to help solve some of those gaps in the wind and solar. I mean, one of the big stories that I've been focused on in California is just sort of how do you put the pieces together on this route to 100% clean electricity. And it's interesting because there are big challenges. There have been issues of rolling blackouts in the evening after the sun goes down. There are questions about long-term, what do you do during the long stretches of time when it's not that sunny or windy. But the encouraging and positive part for me as a reporter is that everywhere I look, it seems pretty reasonable to believe that these are solvable problems, both in terms of the research that's being conducted, showing that, yes, actually, if you make smart decisions that are within the realm of feasibility technically and economically right now, you can put the pieces together, you can keep the lights on, you can keep costs from getting out of control, and you can get carbon and fossil fuels off the power grid, and then you can use the power grid to power electric vehicles and electric buildings as well. There's a ton of research showing that this is doable. And also just, sort of everywhere I look, there are different interesting technologies and softwares and strategies, geothermal, long duration energy storage, et cetera, that, you can tell stories about how this is going to work. So it's a positive area to be. And I mean, Chris referred to the column I wrote, I think it was last week, about the role of a climate journalist in climate solutions. And I can try to put the link in the chat when I get a minute here, but I think that the approach that I've tried to take to climate, that I would encourage other journalists to take as well, is to think about our role in where we would in an issue like defending democracy or solving homelessness. I think those are areas where most reporters would say, yeah, I've got no problem saying that it's a big part of my role as a journalist to make sure that we maintain a stable and vibrant democracy, or to push for solutions to the homelessness crisis, or with COVID, for instance. I mean, I don't think anyone's that ambiguous that we have to be neutral on COVID. I mean, our role is to try to help society solve this and keep people safe. And I think the same approach is warranted to climate, where it's not our job to favor necessarily one solution over another because of our personal preference or beliefs. But I think the phrase I used is that I have no in this piece, I have no vendettas except the one against planet warming emissions, against carbon. And I feel comfortable saying that it should be a vendetta. Amanda dropped the link in the chat. Excellent. I think we should have a vendetta against carbon and against continuing to heat the planet, because the consequences are so dire and we see them all the time. So I just think that there's a shift in approach that is definitely taking place across the journalism profession that's positive, and Sarah is certainly a part of that, and I'm trying to be a part of it, where we see our role not just as like neutrally describing here's what's going wrong in the world and here are what people are saying about it, but here's our evaluation of what the solutions might look like and which ones might be better than others based on the evidence, and asking really hard questions of why are the people in position to make these things happen not doing them, and sort of banging that drum again and again. So yeah, I think energy is a positive place to be, and excited for the rest of this conversation here.
I like the line in your column where you said the future is not preordained, it is not written. We can still stem the climate crisis. And certainly day in, day out, as both of you write about this topic, there has to be some hope, as well as the bad news that hammers through as we wait for more solutions. Sarah, talk a little bit about how you approach energy and climate from a solutions perspective at the Washington Post.
Yeah, so I'm a contributor to the Post's Climate Solutions vertical, where we, do stories from columns that are sort of like climate advice columns about things that people can do, ways people can be involved in creating solutions, to profiles of visionaries who are coming up with, strategies for confronting this crisis. And the way I always think about it, sort of like Sammy said, is that it's when I profile a solution, my goal is not to ever identify a solution as the solution, or even to identify a particular figure or product as like the right way to go about it, but it's more you look at the problem through the lens of what we can do about it, and making sure that people, I mean, I think so often a lot of the despair about climate change comes from this feeling that people have that you know, we're either like waiting for the technology to fix it when like the technology exists in large part, or that you know, there's nothing they can do, that these are intractable problems. And I think, like Sammy said, showing that the barriers to climate action are not physical, they're political, and they're economic, and that that you know, as a regular, I mean, as Americans especially, I mean, writing for a mostly American audience, like we actually have tremendous power. We get to elect the government of the biggest economy on the planet. We get to participate in the biggest economy. And that means that there's actually quite a few ways that people can push for systemic change and enact change in their own lives.
Well, how about your newspapers? Are you able to have the full support? I understand at the Washington Post, you have some good news in terms of coverage of climate, Sarah.
Yeah, we've made a huge investment in climate coverage in the past few years. And actually today, our editor, Sally Busby, announced that we are going to be expanding our coverage significantly, adding 20, I think more than 20 positions, right? You know, not necessarily specifically on the climate team or reporters, but editors and graphics folks and design folks, and you know, making sure that we tell this story in a way that is engaging and relatable, comprehensible, and also empowering. Our editor talks a lot about how do we not just, you know, the goals of the Washington Post are to hold power accountable and to empower readers. And so I think that that is our goal with our climate coverage, is both to identify who in power stands in the way of change, and also to give people the information that they need to be empowered to demand change.
Well, you're in the belly of the beast, so to speak, in Washington, D.C., which is run into roadblocks in terms of bipartisanship. What's your sense of the Biden administration in its first year? How much has it been able to accomplish, given that it's been very hard to get legislation through the Congress? But there has been an effort to make climate a part of every agency. So do you see the Biden administration changing many of the things that have been done under the Trump administration and making improvements?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a variety of different approaches that can be taken on a federal level. There is, I mean, the infrastructure bill that was passed in November does contain a lot of funding for climate resilience, for measures that will help curb emissions. There also seems to be energy, even though the Build Back Better proposal that Biden put forward does seem like it's hit a dead end. There's energy on the Hill, including especially from moderate Democrats, to make sure that some of the climate elements of that legislation gets passed. And there is, support for measures like, tax credits for clean energy and things. So that, there is still sort of a decent outlook. Especially as someone who, I live like 12 blocks from the Capitol, and I feel like what goes on in there is a black box. It is really hard to predict, but I think, that element, there is maybe some reason to think that there's still possibilities there. And then there's also, actions that executive actions that Biden can take and has taken, initiatives to cut the emissions from federal agencies, to replace the federal fleet, which is thousands of vehicles, with electric vehicles. and and he hasn't taken all of the measures that activists say he can, and that has been a source of conflict between some of the green groups that campaigned and volunteered for him. But there are, it's not like without Congress there's nothing that can be done.
Well, Sammy, you're in California, which is a big state, a sunny state by reputation, and climate has been a big issue in this state. And Governor Newsom has promoted new funding to fight climate change. What are some examples of what's going on in California to make some proactive improvements in the climate battle?
Oh gosh, lots and lots of different things. Where do I start? One story that I'll raise here that is starting to get more and more attention nationally, but got started in California is the issue of what to do with natural gas in buildings. So I mean, lots of attention paid to power plants, to cars, but a pretty sizable chunk of emissions in California and the United States come from gas furnaces and gas water heaters and gas stoves and kind of these things that are really baked into our everyday lives. So there have been more than 50 cities and counties in California now that have passed policies that are either strictly banning or strongly discouraging in new construction the use of gas hookups in favor of all electric heaters, stoves, etc. And that's something that the state is starting to take on too. There's been hundreds of millions of dollars that have been budgeted by the legislature and by Newsom to help people pull their gas stoves and their gas furnaces out and replace them with electric alternatives. They're, again, it's sort of similar to what Sarah was saying about the Biden administration. Not everything that activists want. There was a really strong push last year to make the new building code in the state actually require all electric, and they did not go that far. They wrote a building code that gave incentives for developers to build all electric, but didn't strictly require it, which was a source of controversy. So that's one area. And, Chris, you mentioned the budget, which I was writing about recently, and Newsom's latest, budget proposal has billions of dollars for high-speed rail in it, which continues to be a priority here in California as a transportation solution. It's got billions of dollars to help fund the growth of some of those long duration energy storage technologies that I was talking about earlier. Interestingly, it's got some money to test out solar panels on irrigation canals, which is just now getting spent and doled out. That's been an idea people have liked here for a long time of, we all over the Western United States, there are these big canals and ditches moving water around. What if you could put solar panels over them? So there are lots of different creative things that are happening. Housing is a focus here too, the housing climate nexus, where there's, attempts to build denser housing in existing cities and near transit in particular, both as a solution to get housing built that's affordable, which is a crisis in California and a lot of places, but also to limit the amount of time people need to spend driving. So it's just, everything is being thrown against the wall here, and that doesn't necessarily mean it's all being done well or effectively, but there's a lot happening.
What about in the solar and wind areas? It's been a surprise to a lot of people how quickly the prices have actually come down in recent years and made renewable energy more affordable than was earlier predicted. So that's in a way a good news story that there's more attention and more ability to put solar and wind in place now, not for the future.
Yeah, no, that's a super positive story. And in fact, I have the numbers right here on my screen. And in 2020, solar was, big solar farms were responsible for like 13% of the power in California. Wind energy was another 11%. Both of those have gone up substantially in the last year, so those numbers are kind of out of date. But when you add rooftop solar panels in, that's probably another 5 or 10%. It's happening very quickly, and like I said, with batteries seem to be following the same cost curve as solar now, so they haven't quite gotten to the point of like mass affordability, but they look like they're moving in that direction, much as solar panels did, to help keep the lights on after dark and during times when there's cloud cover. So it's really positive. One of the interesting things about the solar and wind story, and this is one of the areas I find most interesting, is what are the remaining challenges to the growth of those energy sources? And like Sarah said, it's not technical. I mean, the technology is there, and increasingly it's not even economic. But politically, and especially in terms of land use, California has been starting to have these issues where people who live in the areas that are sunny and windy, there's been opposition to these facilities, and some of it is sort of, you might call it NIMBY of people who don't want to look at them because they think they're ugly, or legitimately have concerns about what's going to happen to their property values or their quality of life during the construction of these large projects. And then you have environmental issues as well. If you live in a city like Los Angeles, sometimes you might think, oh, you drive out into the desert, it's open, it's empty, it's barren, why not just stick solar panels there? But the reality is that a lot of these places are, undisturbed lands that provide habitat for all sorts of threatened and endangered wildlife and ecosystems in these places. So these are the challenges that are starting to emerge as you get to higher levels of renewable energy. And it's a challenge that California has that is starting to be seen elsewhere as well. And I think is going to be a really big story nationally. And again, not that means there aren't solutions to this. From the research I've seen and the examples that I've reported on it, I think there are ways to sort of strike a balance, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's happening as yet.
Yeah, the footprint of solar with solar farms and wind farms can be a lot bigger than people imagine. But I think there's more acceptance, obviously, that this is a good way to be advancing. Sarah, you wrote recently about disasters and about how 40% of Americans live in a county hit by disasters in 2021. What changes do you think communities, states, and from the federal level are being made to prepare for disasters rather than just have them happen? Because we know these disasters are being fueled in part by climate change, and we know they're going to get worse. So what kind of preparations or adaptation do you see happening around the country?
Yeah, that was a big focus of my coverage last year. I think that there's a colleague and journalist I admire, Kendra Pierre-Lewis, often says there's no such thing. All natural disasters are man-made. And I think that is certainly true with climate-fueled disasters. They're man-made in the fact that they are happening because of humanity's carbon emissions, but they're also the effects of them. What makes a disaster disastrous is often, how people are positioned in harm's way, or the extent to which infrastructure is or is not able to cope with the storm or the wildfire or what have you. And so I've been, if you think about the different categories of climate disaster, one of the sort of less obvious, but in my experience, most terrifying type of disaster is extreme heat, which Los Angeles is experiencing right now in the middle of January. I was in Portland for the heat wave that struck the Pacific Northwest last summer, which scientists say could not have happened without climate change. And I really saw the degree to which the city was just completely caught unprepared. It didn't have any of the systems that a city that is more experienced with handling extreme heat would have. Everything from the fact that the streetcar stopped operating because it physically could not withstand such temperatures, to the fact that a lot of people don't have air conditioning, are also just not educated about sort of the basic, even without air conditioning, there are ways to make homes more livable during extreme heat waves. Learning about things like cross ventilation and when to lower or raise the curtains and stuff. And then also the inaccessibility of cooling centers for people who had nowhere else to go. So, that's something a city can develop a heat action plan. They can have, there's in Philadelphia, which is sort of the often seen as one of the best cities for handling extreme heat. They have a hotline where people can call nurses and ask questions. They have volunteer neighborhood sort of brigades that go out and check on elderly and other vulnerable people. So they have a plan in place and they're able to enact it on short notice. And researchers have shown that it has saved lives. And that is true no matter what disaster you're looking at, whether it's, flooding. There are a lot of ways that you can restore, green areas to mitigate flooding, which are often made worse by expanses of pavement. There's, you can build, improve building codes to make buildings more resistant to wildfire, which I know is being looked at in California. Sammy probably knows more about it than I do. And I mean, I think that that's just the two messages that I always try to get across in my reporting is that this is not inevitable. It's a product of and with both adaptation measures and by stopping emissions, we can save lives and save people and livelihoods and homes. And I think that, again, going back to this idea of knowledge that empowers people, I think knowing that you can't stop a hurricane from hitting you, but there are a lot of ways in which you can make the hurricane less destructive, empowers people to then demand that from their public officials.
Yeah, and Sammy, we've seen fire across the country, but particularly in the West, it has become an ever-present threat. And the fire season is extended to almost the whole year. And we've got fires also even in places like the Arctic where you don't think of fire. Do you see us making progress in terms of fire prevention, since that's clearly related to climate change?
Yeah, actually, just this morning I saw a report. There's a brush fire on the coast in Orange County here in Southern California in February, which unfortunately is not that surprising because, like Sarah said, we're in the middle of a heat wave. It's going to be like 85 or something today, and it's dry, and the Santa Ana winds have been howling through, and this is just how it is now. Is there progress in fighting fires? I mean, yes, but I mean definitely slower than in some of the clean energy areas I was talking about. I mean, it's again pretty reasonably well known, the kinds of things that need to be done. Forest thinning and prescribed burns starting to become more common and more prevalent in the West. There's more funding going to that, but it's still widely acknowledged to be a small fraction of what's needed to really return to healthy forests. One area where there hasn't been a ton of progress is just, not building anymore in these areas that are so primed to burn. And we've already done a lot of that. There have been so many suburbs and exurbs and new communities just built in sort of the worst locations from a fire perspective. And yet, in a lot of ways, we continue to build in those areas. There have been some actions by the state of California recently to, take legal action to try to stop a handful of developments that are really going out into the wildland urban fringes, as they call it. But for the most part, that's still happening because there's a need for housing and because developers can make money doing it, and because those efforts that I was talking about to develop more densely in existing urban footprints have just not quite taken off yet. So, I mean, short answer, yes, progress, but not a ton.
Are we finding some climate migrants, people moving out of areas that are the most vulnerable or dangerous, or is that something that's happening in the rest of the world and Americans are a little bit slow to decide what they need to do about the problem?
I've seen plenty of reports of people who say after a big fire burns through, oh, I'm gonna leave for the city or decamp for another state or something. But you see just as many about people who are so determined to stay in the place where they love and where they're at. It's kind of the same with these everyone is leaving California stories. Yeah, some people are leaving California, but plenty of people are still coming to California. So no, I don't know that there are waves of climate migrants, at least as of yet, especially because after so many of these fires, what happens is that the federal government and the state government of whatever state you're in come in with funding for rebuilding. I mean, that's just how it's been. I mean, there has not been a lot of reform to that system where, Paradise, California burns down in the campfire, and does the federal government provide, money and incentives for people to go and move somewhere else? No, they fund the reconstruction of that town in a place that's going to burn again.
Well, we found that same problem on the coastlines with flooding, that there's been a push to get building codes changed so that people do not build back in such a vulnerable spot, but there's still too much resistance and people wanting to go back to the same spot where they just were flooded. So part of it is getting human behavior to change and people to be willing to make changes.
on that front, the national flood maps that FEMA puts together that affect flood insurance rates were updated last year to incorporate climate projections. And a lot of people, especially actually interestingly, wealthy people with homes in sort of coastal or other flood prone areas are seeing very high rate increases because if your rate also reflects how expensive your house would be if it was damaged. And so there's like some pushback on that now, but it is interesting that that is a way in which that's a federal action that is attempting to address this issue of creating the incentives for people to not be building and living in vulnerable areas.
Well, transportation is one of the big areas of emissions, and that's been a good news story in terms of electric vehicles. It's been surprising in a way, the fact that both the private and public sector are pushing ahead rather quickly to get more all-electric fleets. Is this going more quickly than you thought it would, Sammy?
More quickly than I thought it would. I don't know. I mean, it's definitely seemed the last few years like it's going to speed up. I think I just saw a data point this morning that last year it was like 12 or 13% of the car market in California was electric or plug-in hybrid electric, which was up from like 8% the year before, I think is what I saw. So I mean, it's moving more quickly. It's definitely been interesting to see at a federal level, to go back to Sarah's discussion earlier of Congress and Biden, that one of the areas that it seems like there's pretty widespread agreement on, at least among the Democrats, is funding for electric vehicle charging and expanding the sort of national charging network. There was a bunch of money for that in the infrastructure bill that passed, and there would be a bunch more in the Build Back Better, and that doesn't seem to be one of the things that Joe Manchin or anyone has problems with. So yeah, it's a success story. I mean, is it moving fast enough to meet global climate targets? No. I mean, California, Governor Newsom came out, was it year before last, and said that we're going to have a target in the state of no more zero emission vehicle sales, or no more gasoline vehicle sales, I should say, after 2035. And, that was a big deal because that's not that long in the future, and that's a big change in lifestyle. But at the same time, everyone looking at that and kind of applauding it also, I think, acknowledged that if people are still buying in mass gasoline vehicles in 2035, we're not going to be in great shape.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is like one of the challenges overall with these, like, there are a lot of positive stories of technology that's advancing maybe faster than we anticipated, but it's just like climate change is escalating even faster than technology and economics are shifting. And I mean, that's why activists say that you need these government policies to create incentives to move that transition even faster. It's just that, like, you can't, I mean, electric vehicles are pretty, the prices are coming down. They're already less expensive over the course of their lifetimes than internal combustion engine vehicles. But like, if you're just waiting for that slow transition of the price coming down to accelerate or to get our, the transportation fleet to turn over, like, it's not going to happen fast enough. And then the other piece is also that, like, technological solutions alone are not sufficient. I mean, you need, like, not everyone driving an electric vehicle instead of an internal combustion engine car is not necessarily like a more sustainable world. You also need public transit and, like, the changing, urban design and the density of communities to make it possible for people to not have to own a car. And so there are these positive stories, and then there's also the systemic changes that are needed in order to take the technological advancements that have already happened and build on them. Sometimes they're still not happening.
One thing that I would, I'm sorry,
Yeah,
one thing that I would add there, I'm on the topic of fast but not fast enough. I mean, something that I've heard Joe Manchin say a number of times is, specifically with regards to this program that was originally in Build Back Better, that would have provided incentives and penalties to get the electric grid to, roughly 100% or close to 100% clean by 2035, which is what a bunch of studies have showed, and, would be in line with global climate targets. His commentary on that was, well, this transition is happening anyway to cleaner energy. Why do we have to pay people to do what they're already doing, to switch from fossil fuels to solar and wind? And, you hear arguments like that all the time. And I think that what gets missing is exactly what Sarah said, which is just because the transition is happening and happening more quickly doesn't mean it's happening fast enough to, to reach half of our emissions by 2030 and then to get to net zero or close to zero by 2045. We're just, we're not in line for that. And if we want to keep warming to, 1.5 or even 2 Celsius, which is what the governments of the world have agreed to based on the, the best science that's out there, it just, at least at the moment, there's no sign that it's going to happen that fast without, concerted policy to make it move faster.
Well, and there tends to be, I think, two kinds of stories too often in journalism, new hope and no hope. And we do have a kind of seesaw where some new technology is going to bring answers and solutions. And then as the story plays out, we find out, of course, that all of these take longer and run into some roadblocks. One area of technology that's been pretty controversial is the idea of geoengineering, that we could engineer our way out of the climate crisis. And I know, Sarah, you've written about geoengineering in the ocean. What's your sense of whether or not there's the power or the sentiment to pursue geoengineering, which is still pretty far off and still pretty controversial?
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say that unlike the technologies we've been talking about so far, solar and wind and EVs and things, geoengineering has not been proven at scale. It hasn't been, we don't fully, like, the science is not there in terms of fully understanding what all the implications of the various methods are. I mean, there's talk about this idea of solar radiation management. So basically you put stuff in the atmosphere to make more clouds, which then cause, which reflect sunlight back into space. But again, like, what are the ripple effects on weather, on agriculture? We don't know. There's been was a rogue effort about a decade ago to dump a bunch of iron in the ocean and try to fertilize it to stimulate algae to do more photosynthesis. But again, there's no evidence that that actually sucked up any more carbon than the ocean normally does. So I think that there's interest in geoengineering, and there's a scientific argument for investigating it, both its feasibility and for studying, what should the governance of something like this be should the globe as a community decide to undertake it. Especially like Sammy said, we have this, the Paris Agreement commits the world to limiting warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius with an aim towards limiting it to 1.5 C. And, that there's like speculation that should we overshoot, you could then use geoengineering to try to draw down more carbon, get us back to the temperature that is safe for human society and for ecosystems. And there's a lot of, overshoot is also dangerous, right? There's a potential of crossing thresholds or losing species or systems that can't be recovered. So I think, all of that is to say that, like, geoengineering is not a near-term solution. It is not a substitute, just scientifically, for actual emissions reductions.
You mentioned the global perspective. You covered the COP26 in Glasgow at the end of last year. Did you come out of that with some sense that the nations of the world are finally getting their act together, or is it even more chaotic at the international level than it is at the federal level?
Yeah, COP was, I would not say that it made me more optimistic about global climate action. I mean, on the one hand, I think it is really powerful just to see, that many people from around the world, not just, the ministers and the negotiators and the political leaders, but also all of the activists that flocked to Glasgow, all of the people with real ideas about, how to confront this crisis. That's inspiring. And it was really moving. I covered the big protest that happened in the middle of the 2-week conference in Glasgow, and there were like 100,000 people marching in frigid rain. I could not feel my fingers. And it was quite impressive to see that many people turn out and in those conditions.
Right.
But I think that, the other piece of it is also that, like, it was very illuminating how these, there are big sticking points that as a global community, I think that we haven't figured out how to overcome yet. One of the big fights at COP26 was about, the setting up a system, a carbon market for, buying and trading credits to try to bring down global emissions. And there was a big dispute over whether or not there should be a fee as part of that market that goes towards adaptation in low-income countries that are disproportionately bearing the burden of climate impacts, even though they've contributed very little to global emissions. And that was resisted by the US and by other industrialized countries. And so it's, these questions about like equity, about what do countries that made their wealth off of the fossil fuel system owe to the places that now are trying to develop without fossil fuels while coping with escalating climate impacts. These questions about loss and damage and who pays for it, those are still very much unresolved. And I think that it also was really striking how it does seem like, especially for larger developing nations that are producing a lot of emissions, like India, for example, where they both have real development needs and millions of people who are living in poverty who need access to energy. They want to see some kind of climate justice. And I think that it does seem like as long as there's not, the longer it takes to find solutions on the climate justice front, like that does hold back efforts to decarbonize overall.
Yeah, well, no question that climate injustice has received finally more attention than it did in the past. I'm going to go to a couple of questions we have from the audience. One, we have some journalists who are tuning in, and one journalist asked, what advice do you all have for those of us in small local newsrooms who might be the only person covering the climate crisis, especially if we're trying to build an environmental issues beat from the ground up on top of my other top-down directed beats? So you both work at large, prosperous, or at least big newspapers with big teams of environmental reporters. How do we get more coverage at the local level, since this is an area of great concern that we're losing local coverage? Any advice for someone starting out?
I guess I would just say two things. One of which will probably be obvious. I mean, the first and obvious one, just if you're a local news reporter covering climate, there's so many different stories that you could be telling, and it probably will seem so overwhelming. So I would just say, really focus on the value that you can add to your community, what stories are not being told. You don't have to write about what's happening at the federal level. You don't even necessarily have to write about what's happening at the state level, except as it affects your place. I mean, really think about what stories about where you are not going to be told unless you tell them, would be the first thing. And the second thing is, if you're the only one, think about encouraging your editor, but encouraging other reporters at your news organization to think about how climate intersects with their beat. I mean, it's such an everything story. If you have a health reporter, an education reporter, local government, or someone doing politics, or someone writing about, you could almost name any other topic here, immigration, and there would be a strong climate nexus. So it doesn't just have to be you. And if you can tell some good stories on that beat, hopefully you can show your colleagues that it's worth their time as well.
Yeah, I think that's important. The team building, your health reporter has definitely got an environmental and climate and energy story to tell. And even the reporters that are talking about national security have stories to tell that bring in the climate questions. One of our questioners says, it seems as with COVID, climate impacts are taking lives and property simply because of misinformation being widespread among mostly Americans. Do you think we're making progress in fighting this disinformation, which has definitely been a problem in fighting climate change?
I mean, I definitely think if you look at, the Yale program on climate communication does these surveys of, America's stances on climate change, and they have this Six Americas framework, and overwhelmingly Americans believe in climate science. They support federal efforts, government efforts to shift the economy away from, polluting activities. I think that this notion that we have to convince people that climate change is real, I think is that, and it, like, we're no longer in that world. People are convinced. What the misinformation, I think that journalists have to battle now is this notion that it's real, but there's not really anything that can be done, or that there are purported solutions, which are not actually solutions, are going to make a difference. I think, like the misinformation is less about, convincing people of something that they can see by looking out their window, and more about giving them real, factual, contextualized information about, okay, well, what can be done?
Right. Another question we have is going back to where we started at the beginning about how you report the story and departing from the notion of neutrality. And the viewer says, can you elaborate about how you diffuse possible criticism for you and your media for having an agenda or being biased? Do you think getting personal has impaired your ability to listen to voices that might not be climate deniers, but might have different views? So, Sammy, what's your sense of getting personal? And I think you have articulated that in your recent column about how taking a personal interest in being personally engaged is actually good for journalism and good for covering this beat.
Yeah. I mean, I think something that I think about there is just differentiating between good faith and bad faith criticism. So, I mean, to the extent that there's still hardcore climate denial out there, which is, as Sarah said, is a smaller and smaller amount of people, it's easy for me to totally ignore that. And then you get into a more gray area where there's, most folks who are, sort of on the quote unquote other side of this debate at this point are more coming from, well, there is climate change. It's important. We need to do something about it. But there are all of these other considerations to take. And can we really move this quickly? Is it, what's it going to do to people's energy costs? Are we going to keep the lights on? Is it going to cause other problems like, mining for lithium, for instance, or destroying habitats to build solar farms? And there's criticism that I think is, legitimate and worthwhile, and criticism that seems clearly designed to, to frustrate and to serve just a fossil fueled economic interest, which I typically find to be less legitimate. So, definitely it's important to not just shut out all voices that aren't saying a certain thing. I mean, for instance, I was talking earlier about natural gas use in buildings, and I think there's a very important side of that conversation, which I've tried to highlight in my coverage, where, even as I'm doing accountability reporting on gas companies and on forces that are trying to block action in this area, there are important questions that they're raising about, are people going to want to use an induction stove, or are they going to want to keep burning gas because people like to cook that way? And, really, who can afford to do this right now? It's not like solar where it's gotten a lot cheaper. I mean, electric heat pumps are still more expensive to put in if you're going to, tear out your gas furnace. So, So that's important. And I mean, I have a close relationship with the American Gas Association. I should say I'm on good terms with them. A close relationship with anyone is a fraught thing to say as a journalist, but I talk to them and they're a part of my stories, and I think that's important. So I would just say, like, to journalists thinking about this, don't worry so much about the bad faith criticism, and sort of figure out where the line is for you in terms of what's actually worth taking into account, and worry about that.
Yeah, if you said in that column that if you were biased, it was biased toward climate solutions, which again is something that needs to be reported on, and that can help combat some of this climate despair. Do either of you get to a stage of having despair given the deadlines that come along, that in 7 years we need to accomplish this, or the fact that the global warming is increasing faster than the actions? How do you combat that despair?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel a lot of anxiety and heartache about this topic. I think, not so much as like I feel doomed, because I don't think that the science supports that civilization is doomed. But what it does say is that there is going to be tremendous suffering, right? Millions and millions of people affected, displaced from their homes, killed prematurely. And that, even if like climate change does not bring about the end of civilization, the thought of that many people suffering because of something that was avoidable, like, is really distressing and upsetting, and we should be upset about it. I mean, the thing is, it's not even just a future thing, it's a now thing. I talk to people all the time who have lost their homes, who have lost loved ones in disasters that we know were made worse by climate change. And that hurts. And it can feel, I think, really frustrating, sort of seeing this pain and just knowing that the action is not happening fast enough. But I think that the other piece of it, and this is something that has really, like, this comes out of the science, is that like every 1/10 of a degree of warming avoided makes the future measurably, significantly better. And so that means that climate action will always matter, even if it's taken too late, even if it's happening too slow, and that like our efforts matter. And that I wouldn't necessarily call that a hopeful thought, but it's a motivating thought, because it's even if this change is not all happening at the pace that I wish that it was, I know that the change that does happen will make the future better for me, for the people I write about, and for generations to come.
And you get discouraged at all about the international situation? Things are happening in the US that have happened around the world and gotten less attention. Are we getting more of a global perspective from journalists covering this as an international story from one pole to the other?
Yeah, I mean, that's actually part of this expansion of climate coverage that the Post is undertaking, is going to involve climate reporters who are based abroad, which we haven't had before. I also see a lot more interest from my colleagues on our foreign desk in covering climate change and, wanting to understand things like the IPCC reports. So certainly, we're invested and trying to cover this more. It is really heartbreaking, and like being at COP, it just, I think about Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who said, the world is talking about the difference between 1.5 and 2C of warming as though it's like this negotiable thing. But for my community, 2C is a death sentence. And that's true for a lot of places, and a lot of people. And they don't have the voice or the power that people in the United States have. So I do think that part of my job and mission is to, that's why it's so important to educate American readers, especially about solutions, because we have the power to undertake those solutions in a way that a lot of folks don't.
Right. Well, I have great concerns and have focused a lot on the Arctic And there's been a kind of truism that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. And now that has been upped with recent studies that say it may be 4 times as fast as the rest of the world. Are we paying enough attention to what's happening in the Arctic region and in the Antarctic?
Yeah, I mean, I think
It's
that the
some scary stuff, yeah.
The Arctic is in some ways like the canary in the coal mine. It's, you know, the Post did this series 2C, which my colleagues won the Pulitzer for it, where they looked at places around the world where warming has already exceeded 2 degrees Celsius, and the Arctic is one of those places. And so it's like, they called it pieces of the future in the present. And so it really enables us to see what climate change and the kind of ecosystem and collapse that climate change and system, you know, human system collapse that climate change will trigger. Like looking at the Arctic allows us to understand what that looks like, what it looks like when the changing weather conditions cause roads to buckle and buildings and, you know, coastlines to collapse, and you can't depend on things being the way they used to be. And then the other piece of it is also that we increasingly have evidence that what happens in the Arctic is affecting what happens at lower latitudes. And there's a growing body of research that is trying to connect these buckling in the jet stream that is caused by Arctic warming with extreme weather events that happen, such as the deep freeze that occurred in Texas last year. But also, you know, it's potentially affecting the amount that the courses that hurricanes take. And so that's not settled research, but it's definitely something that, like, you know, it's a truism in climate change coverage that, like, oh, people think it's just about polar bears and like don't focus on the polar bears. And I think that sometimes that makes journalists you know, want to write about impacts that are happening in places where most people live. And the Arctic is obviously not as densely populated as mid latitudes, but also what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. And I think that's
still true.
Yeah.
It's truism, but it's still the truth. Well,
Yeah.
would you say, as we wind up here, are you both optimists by nature? And tie this in with your love of baseball. I mean, you, Sarah, you're a Brooklyn native and you love the New York Mets, and Sammy, you're the LA Dodgers. How can sports help bring some optimism to the climate question? And actually, climate change is probably changing baseball with more heat and storms interfering with your favorite sport. So how's it looking in terms of your optimism for sports?
I would say it's the bottom of the 6th inning and we're down by 4 or 5 runs, which doesn't look good, but there's a lot of baseball to play. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good metaphor. Yeah, I mean, I think I wouldn't call myself an optimist, but I also feel like you don't have like I said before, what happens now matters. There's a lot that's locked in, but there is also there's still this wide range of possible futures that we're facing. And if I can spend my time trying to shift that future towards one that is safer and healthier and happier for humanity and for, you know, the places and ecosystems that I love, then that seems worthwhile.
Yeah, and it's very important. I hope people will continue talking about the issue, and will also be tuning into mainstream media, because you guys are doing a great job in covering a really complex issue that gets more complex and dangerous by the day. Do you have any last closing words as we're running out of time here?
I liked what Sarah just had to say. That's the best ending we could have.
Well, thank you both very much for bringing at least some positivity to the issue of climate change and solutions journalism, and good luck as you go forward with that. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks, Chris.